a car park, a greenhouse, an air hangar, a bulb factory, the smallest caravan you've ever seen, a bench, a lift in a shopping centre, a waiting room, a photo booth, the doorway of the HSBC Bank, the stairwell of some flats, an abandoned Ford Sierra. I walked out of the room that I'd been renting the day the rent ran out. I left all my possessions behind. It was March, but the sun was shining and it was unusually mild. I bunked the train to West Ealing and walked from there to Ealing Broadway, pouncing a fag from someone at the bus stop. I walked to the main line platform at Ealing Broadway and waited. When the first Intercity 125 approached, heading out of the city at high speed, I stepped forward across the yellow line and took a deep breath. But as I tried to take another step forward, I was met with an invisible force that wouldn't let me through. A spiritual bounce happened, my life force, if you will. Everything in me wanted to go. Everything other than this mime artist's invisible wall that I was bumping up against. I felt the rush of the wind push and pull me, vibrate my body as the train screamed inches from my face. And so it went on. Every half an hour I went through this ritual, but each time, determined to do it, I was met with an equally determined resistance which delayed and frustrated me. As evening descended and the temperature started to drop, I headed out of the station, walked to Marks and Spencer's and shoplifted a bottle of vodka. I sat on the green opposite the station and drank it. And so it continued, much like the first bottle of vodka outside the school disco at 13. I just thought I would stay drunk as much as is humanly possible. The early spring had receded back into winter, and I took to riding the trains to stay warm. By accident, I had ended up in Hammersmith. I found a triangle of supermarkets that I could shop with from, and I moved into my first doorway, the HSBC Bank, King Street. It was a good doorway as doorways go. It had automatic doors which closed and kept the draft out when people weren't using the cash points. I mostly got left alone until a security guard would wake me up at 6 a.m. I later moved up the property ladder into an abandoned Ford Sierra just off the Golden Road, until I came home one day and found that somebody had smashed all the windows and there was shards of glass all over the back seat. Breakfast was served at Market Lane Day Centre, if I managed to get there in time. Sausages, beans, toast and tea. It was here that I had my first contact with homeless services. The outreach team said that they needed to find me sleeping rough twice so that they knew I was really homeless. Although by then I had chunks of hair falling out of my head and I stank in a way that could not be fabricated to get a leg up in the property market. Having lost my Sierra and somebody else moving into my doorway, I never really knew where I was going to be sleeping from day to day, so they never managed to find me. But after a while they said that they would falsify the evidence and they began looking for a room for me. One day my lucky number came in. They said a bed had become available in a hostel in Earl's Court. I waited around all day before being informed that the hostel had decided that I was too high risk and they couldn't offer me a bed after all. This was due to my recent suicide attempts, and so I was sent back out onto the streets. Some time later, I don't know how long, time was not operating in the way it should by now. I found myself in a taxi to King's Cross with a freshly acquired bottle of vodka. I came to later that day in a wet lounge in York Way Emergency Night Shelter run by St Mungo's. I remember the first night in that grotty single bed. It felt like the most luxurious experience of my life. I managed to get hold of my best friend Michael. He came to see me in Camden. I'll never forget the look of disdain and disgust on his face when he saw me. The DTs, the second-hand clothes, the homeless man's beard, the smell. It was like I was no longer human, no longer a part of his world, and that was a look that I got very used to seeing on people's faces. I got a new best friend. His name was Scouse. I've no idea what his real name was. He was just Scouse. I followed Scouse because he seemed to know what he was doing. We would congregate in the Boneyard, which was a grotty little park in Camden, surrounded by gravestones. It was a meeting place for the desperate. If anything, things got worse when I got a roof over my head. I started to witness a kind of drug use, addiction and deprivation that I'd never seen before. It's like I'd fallen through the floor of a party that I'd been in into some dark, frightening world from which there was no exit. After about 6 weeks of absolute chaos in Camden, I was told that they'd found a more permanent bed for me back in Shepherd's Bush. I arrived at Market Lane. I was shown my room and told that Ali, the previous resident, had died in the bed last night. There were still some stains on the mattress. I was kept awake all night by two people screaming either side of my room, and out of frustration, I managed to break my window, which almost got me kicked out the following morning. About 6 months later, I was at the funeral of one of the guys that had been screaming. His name was Jon. He was ex-services and had PTSD. He drank until he turned yellow. He was admitted to hospital, but came back the same day with 2 big bottles of cider and died the next day. I carried his coffin at his funeral. There was only me, one other hostel resident, and 2 members of staff at his funeral. I think this was a point where I really faced the reality of my situation. I spent a year at Market Lane. It was full of characters, full of danger, full of madness. My drug use accelerated. I became fiercely physically dependent on White Ace cider. There were so many memorable, fascinating characters in that hostel. There was Marge, who claimed to be a former member of the English Royal Ballet, who would go out as a man in the daytime and come back to the hostel dressed as a female ballerina in chiffon and pirouette around the courtyard of an evening. There was Eddie, an Irish traveller, a quiet man who never touched drugs, who kept his accommodation spotlessly clean, who lifted weights on his balcony each morning, and who, without trying, commanded respect. For the last 2 months of my time at Market Lane, Eddie wanted to kill me. This was due to my own stupidity and some expert skullduggery from a crack addict named Frenchie. I owed Eddie £50, which I couldn't pay back. Every time I came in, I had to make sure the coast was clear and dart in the shadows to the hostel. There was Dublin Jim, who slept in a flower bed outside the hostel because he was banned. Market Lane itself It was a grubby, piss-stained alleyway that led down to the day centre and the hostel. A light came on in that alleyway one day. It wasn't a bright light. It was the tiniest hint of a flicker, a possibility that light might exist, that life might exist beyond homelessness. A woman had plotted up there every day at the mouth of the alleyway and laid out her wares, some old shoes, some obsolete electrical items, the odd cuddly toy. I can't remember why, but she'd given me a small stuffed monkey one day, and she then started to find more stuffed monkeys and save them for me. Maybe it were these small acts of kindness that helped to ignite that light. A few months later, I was bundled into another taxi, this time on my way to detox. I'd gone out with a bang. I'd left Keith's crack house at about 5 in the morning, and I wasn't particularly enthusiastic about starting my new life. It was the first day of Lent. I landed in a room with a guy called Cornelius, and we laughed, asking each other, "What are you giving up for Lent?" 9 months later, I was sitting in a dry house in West Kensington. I've been obsessing about using drugs for 3 days. I walked to Shepherd's Bush and rang the buzzer to Keith's crack house. He answered and said that he didn't have anything, but he would have in an hour. For the first time in my life, a voice of reason overrid the voice of obsession. It told me that it wasn't up to me when I stopped. It wasn't up to me if I stopped tonight or tomorrow or in 5 years. It wasn't up to me if I died on the streets. It wasn't up to me what the consequences of this relapse would be. That I had no power and no choice. If I put that first rock on the pipe or opened that first can, it told me to go home, have a cup of tea, and if I still wanted to use after that, I could always come back. So I went home and I went to bed clean. And the next morning, I went to a 12-step meeting and surrendered. Being clean was weird. I had a head full of regrets about the past. My behaviour suddenly was slapping me in the face, the reality of the way I treated people, treated myself. And when I wasn't regretting, I was worrying about the future. I was worrying about who I'd be, what I could do with my life, whether there was anything salvageable. I started walking across London, from west to east, from south to north, and really looking at the world for the first time. Somebody gave me a really basic digital camera, and I started taking that on my walks to record my journeys. And what I found was that taking photos brought me into the here and now. It quietened my mind. It became like a visual meditation. And all I thought about was light and colour, shape and tone. And this replaced my worries and my regrets while I was photographing. When I was about a year clean, I was walking back down Market Lane. I was now attending a 12-step meeting in the day centre. It was dark, and I saw something glowing halfway down the lane. It was a shrine, a black and white photograph of a man that I knew. It was Eddie. Next to his photo was a small glass bottle with some plastic flowers in. These were illuminated by a red light, a rear bicycle light. It was a humble and profound tribute. I tried to encourage people from the hostel to come to the 12-step meeting. Not many came, but one young man did. His name was Martin. He had no teeth, was about 8 stone, but I could tell that he really wanted to get out. He wanted to escape the life he was living. We became friends, and over the next 10 years, he would tell me all about his life, and I watched him rebuild his life. I watched him get his son back in his life, build a career, help others, and become the person that he was always meant to be. When I was a few years clean, I found myself at Central St Martin's School of Art. I started to use photography to explore specific memories, experiences, things that I found difficult to process. One of the first places I went was Camden. I'd been too frightened to go back to Camden. It held this irrational terror, the idea of going back there, of bumping into the characters, of getting dragged back into their life. So the camera became my passport to travel back in time, to visit places that held memory for me, to re-explore experiences. I returned to Ealing Broadway and to the platform and to the memory. I wanted to photograph the trains and to record the sound of them tearing through the station. I didn't really know why, but some pain and sadness was shifted that day. One of the experiences that I'd always struggled with was my dad's last walk. When I was 8 years old, he went for a walk late at night and didn't come back. I'd always felt confused and angry about this situation, abandoned, let down, relieved, but mostly confused. I asked my mum about the details of the night, the time of year. I went out with my camera at a similar time of night as he had, and I retraced his footsteps. I photographed what I saw along the way: puddles, piles of autumn leaves. What I found was, for the first time, I felt deep empathy for him. At the time, he was a very young man, younger than I was, when doing this walk. He was an addict. He had bipolar disorder, and he was lost. So the first time, some of the anger and confusion lifted. And when I looked to the photos later, they helped me to keep seeing this experience from this new perspective. And I realized the power of images to shift things in a way that years of writing and talking hadn't managed to do. When COVID hit and we went into lockdown, I turned to photography again. I visited my neighbours, my friends, my family on my daily walk and photographed them through their windows. This kept me sane, kept me connected, and gave me a sense of purpose during this time. And I realised that life is too short to be spending 8 hours a day on a purpose that didn't really fit. And so I spent that summer trying to work out what I should be doing with my life. And I came up with the idea of a therapeutic photography course. Since then, I've delivered my course with all kinds of groups, people in recovery, young people with learning difficulties, NHS staff, new mums, and most recently with a homeless charity, The Connection. And I've spent many hours out with guys that are currently street homeless with a load of cameras, photographing what we find. And in that time, we stop being a group of homeless people and we become a group of photographers. And when we get back to the centre and look at the photos that we took together, we see our talent and we see our individual interests and we see our unique perspective on the world and we see something that we can be proud of. For the last couple of years, I've been lucky enough to become part of Kindred Studios, which is a thriving community of artists and makers in West London. And this has become a base for me to deliver my therapeutic photography workshops, but also to dig deeper into my story and my experiences of homelessness, of addiction, of my struggles with mental health. It's a beautiful, supportive community where I can, for the first time in my life, really be my authentic self at work. Now, the craziest and most wonderful part of the story is that Kindred Studios' current home is a former homeless hostel in West London. So every day I cycle down the same lane where that light came on and get to work in the same building where I smashed that window. I practiced Qigong with my fellow artists in that same courtyard where Marge pirouetted. We put on exhibitions in the same space where I used to get my sausage, beans and toast in the morning. And every day that I walk in, I see the mural that I painted of Martin, who sadly lost his battle with addiction last year at the age of 41. And tomorrow I'll be painting a backdrop in a gorilla suit in the flower bed where Dublin Jim used to sleep. Dublin Jim got clean, and he'd always say to me in our years in recovery together, "It's good to be alive, John. It's good to be alive." And he'd remind me of all the people from the hostel that had passed away since we got clean. I think Jim and myself are the only survivors. When I first returned to the building to meet Angelique, the founder of Kindred Studios. I told her about my history with the building and how important it was to me, how incredible that it was now Artist Studios. I told her which room was mine, as she told me that in my room, when they'd taken over the building, they'd found a £50 note hidden behind a light fitting, along with a picture of Mother Teresa. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This could only have been Eddie, some kind of attempt to make things right. That was the kind of guy Eddie was.